So enter the idea of electronic Confederates. And what we're calling electronic Confederates at this point, sort of loosely defined, but these are computer-based actors that simulate responsiveness to human inputs. And that simulate piece is going to be important here in a minute. So they may not be as fully reactive as artificial intelligence might be, but they appear to be responsive to human inputs, and they behave in a dynamic and humanely authentic manner. So they present as if real people. And these can be used to manipulate one of two things. Either first, just contextual experiences, such as social facilitation and interaction effects, or observation of social behavior. We watch them behaving in social ways, but also interpersonal experiences. You put subjects in the position where they engage in exchanges with others who may vary in their politeness, in their creativity, in certain leadership behaviors, in states or traits. But most importantly, when thinking about electronic Confederates, is actually the context that they operate in. And the idea of electronic Confederates is you have to leverage carefully constructed and electronically mediated study contexts that are first going to allow for organic and somewhat realistic interactions between the human participant and the Confederate, but also reducing true interdependence or deep interaction to the point where your real participants aren't going to figure out that they're just interacting with a bot. Now, revisiting for a second some of those downsides to real Confederates, some of the benefits of electronic Confederates include, first, they don't fatigue. They don't become wise to your study goals. So you have no real risk of a demand characteristic. They don't experience moods, or they don't have behavioral preferences that interfere with the manipulation. If you ask an electronic Confederate to behave or design it to behave in an extroverted manner, you're not having to overcome its proclivities for introversion. They also allow us to run experimental sessions simultaneously. You can collect a lot of data at one time because electronic Confederates can be in a lot of places at once. You can also deal with manipulation irrelevant traits by either minimizing them or sort of thoughtfully managing them. So for example, doing things like having people create a username that isn't their real name. So the electronic Confederate has a gender neutral name as well. Also, electronic-based, Confederate-based manipulations can be pre-validated. We can really assess their content validity using expert panels. So in this case, in Schulpson et al., this was a paper published in OBHDP with my wife. We were interested in using electronic Confederates for incivility. So what we did was ahead of time generate a list of potential rude behaviors and sent it out to 10 experts on interpersonal mistreatment, and made sure that the behaviors of the electronic Confederate were rude, but not representing undermining or abuse or other things that might be sort of closely related constructs. And also, compared to using something like a vignette, you can really increase people's engagement by using electronic Confederates. You know, with vignette studies, people always sort of worry like, oh, of course you found effects, vignettes are so obvious. Believe it or not, the problem with vignette studies is getting people sufficiently engaged that they even recognize the manipulation or even notice it in the first place. So this gives you the potential to really make a manipulation nice and salient and strong, but also as compared to vignettes where people can maybe render judgments, in this case, you can capture real behavioral DVs because they're interacting with something. So a couple examples of early sort of tools that are out there. The classic kind of first use of electronic Confederates is probably Kip Williams' Cyberball task. Now, interesting thing about Cyberball is Kip Williams wasn't really necessarily trying to create something that was deeply realistic. The goal of this was to show that ostracism effects or social exclusion is such a powerful human motive that even in a very sort of impoverished environment, people are likely to experience it. So in Cyberball, participants log on to a computer task. These naive participants log in, and you have a couple other players that are showing up. So you see their faces, you see their names, and you see these little animated characters. And in the task, all you're asked to do is just pass a ball between yourself and these other people. Now, the only parameter that gets manipulated in Cyberball is the probability of receiving the ball on a particular task. So you can see that hand down in the bottom there. That's actually the real participant. And within Cyberball, you either get like a 1 in 4 chance of the ball coming to you, which is what probabilistically you'd expect, or the other players just sort of ignore you for about 5 minutes and don't pass to you. And it's been pretty powerful for simulating ostracism effects. There is some organizational research that's relied on this. One of my favorite studies is Kuchaki and Wareham. So Miriam Kuchaki and her co-author in this used social exclusion and demonstrated that it leads to higher physiological arousal, which then spills over into more unethical behavior. Now, cyberball is a really cool and very powerful tool, but it only kind of does one thing, right? It's good for manipulating ostracism. There's not very deep engagement or involvement here. And I kind of learned a little bit more about cyberball coming out of a background doing implicit cognition work and using the IAT. I learned a package called Inquisit, which is a software package put out by Millisecond. It was developed by Sean Drain while he was a PhD student at the University of Washington, working with Tony Greenwald in the IAT lab. As I started kind of digging into other tools that were out there, I came across Cyberball and thought to myself, wouldn't it be neat if you had something similar to Cyberball, but was more flexible and would allow for deeper interaction? And from there, iteratively, a task was born called Synergize. Now, Synergize we describe in that Leavitt, Chu, and Shapiro paper, as well as providing resources for it. And there's a few different versions of Synergize. But at a high level, it's a timed creativity task. So participants believe they're logging in for a creativity task, either with other people online or other people who are in the same lab as them, as well as another lab at another campus, which allows for some uncertainty about who they're actually playing with. And in this game, they're coming up with creative uses for an object, either a paper clip or the creative uses for a brick task. And Synergize is built around the idea of team incentives. So for every time you score a point, every time you come up with a creative use and pass the ball or pass the turn to the next person, your score goes up. So you can tell people, hey, you're going to get paid 25 cents or $1 per every point the team scores. We tell them the cover story with Synergize is that we're ostensibly interested in geographically dispersed teams and how people who don't know each other very well may come together to form creative synergies. And this is a cover story that seems to work really, really well, especially with student populations, with the idea being that in a geographically dispersed world, you may work with virtual teams and you know very little about the other players, so try to kind of figure out what you can about them. Now within Synergize, what really differentiates it from Cyberball, other than the actual creativity task, is you can send public or private chat comments or even voice messages to other team members during their turns. The manipulated electronic Confederates can make comments based on provided profiles, names, or responses of the participant. So for example, they could say something like, hey, dog just came up with the least creative use I've ever heard, or use that character's actual name in their chat comments, or use that person's answers to comment. So it makes them feel very engaged because this Confederate is actually referring to them by name or using the answers that they have generated. So also there's embedded naivety and optional manipulation checks built into the program. So when it gets to the end, we tell people either, hey, because everybody's pulled from a common subject pool, do you think you know which of these, did you know who any of these other players were? Or if we're doing it online and using it in like an M-Turk setting, we'll say, because this is a global study, can you guess what country the other participants are from? And if they come back and say, I don't think they were real people, then you know you have a non-naivety problem. But if they come back and say, I have no idea what country, or I think it was the US, or very frequently when we've done this in a lab setting, yeah, I think it was my friend who was sitting 3 chairs over, then you know that people, at least at that point in the task, weren't aware that they were engaging with bots. And another nice thing about Synergize is it's freely available. Again, Feng-Chu made these great resources that make it very easy to plug and play. It currently requires Inquisit software. At some point, my goal is to maybe see if I can engage in some grant writing and have somebody build out something that's freely available outside of that platform, so you can just plug it and play it, and anybody can use it in their research without any sort of real investment. Some places Synergize has been used. A paper with Amir Erez and colleagues in AMJ in 2015, we were interested in looking at actor-target personality trait interactions. So in other words, when you work on a team with people who are introverted versus extroverted, and your own traits of introversion and extroversion, does it lead to performance rating biases? Largely what we found is extroverts don't necessarily care who they're working with. They rate people consistently, but trait introverts, when they interact with people who are highly extroverted or people who are disagreeable, they actually misrate their performance and rate it lower as a function of engaging with people who are just sort of overstimulating to them. Shilpson and colleagues, 2016 in OBHTP. In this paper, we were looking at the effects of witnessed versus experienced rudeness. A lot of research that shows that just watching incivility can lead to the same negative effects as experiencing it. In this particular paper, we were interested though in what happens when somebody isn't rude to just you or just one other person, what happens when somebody is rude publicly to more than one person? Does it change your attributional process? And what we found is that when somebody is a jerk, sort of a public jerk to multiple people, as opposed to a stealth jerk and rude to just you, even if you can't make an attribution for why they're doing it, you also get the idea that it isn't your fault. And a lot of things like withdrawal from the task go away as the rumination stops. And a paper that I'm not a part of with Feng Chu and his colleagues just published a paper in JAP. This is a really cool paper on the idea that ethical leadership mitigates the moral ownership creativity penalty. So there's been a lot of great research in ethics showing that the link between creativity and ethics is a negative one, and it kind of goes both ways. But in this case, just having a team leader who displays ethical behavior allows you to sort of loosen up and know that somebody else is going to manage that piece of it, which allows you to know that ethical standards will be met so you can still engage in creativity instead of having to engage in so much sort of censorship. Now, as far as Synergize go, there's two easily adaptable versions that are out there, just as a quick overview. The first is designed for manipulating team member traits for interpersonal treatment. So this is the one we used in Errors et al. 2015. So this is really good if you're interested in looking at either spillover effects within teams, or if you're interested in just social judgments more broadly. So in this version, when people log in, the first thing they do is they take just a quick little survey. And we've either used the Saussure mini markers of the Big Five, or I actually even like to give people the Myers-Briggs, even though it's a totally sort of non-predictive of anything task. What it's useful for is convincing participants that you're creating a profile about them based on information they give. So they take this and they're asked to write a few adjectives about themselves, but then they see these profiles of other team members based theoretically on what the computer calculated from the survey, as well as what people said about themselves. And this is a way to set up an initial manipulation of a trait or whatever you're interested in about that electronic confederate. And then their behavior reinforces that manipulation throughout the task. And when you get to the end of this version of the task, there's optional scales to rate Confederate performance, to distribute rewards, things like that. So if you're really interested in how people respond to team members, this version works well for that. The other version that we've made available is about unethical team member behavior, which is great for studying things like cheating, whistleblowing, or enabling cheating behavior. And in this version of the task, people are told that this is really a beta version of Synergize. They're told that the system can't really recognize good answers from bad answers. So if you can't come up with an answer in your turn and you need to go ahead and pass it, type the word pass, and you won't earn any points for that turn, but you can give a turn to another player. So the idea being they discover this exploitable loophole. Now, one of the electronic Confederates sends a message, type fast, more money, and then instead of giving good creative uses or entering the word pass, just enters nonsense strings, just types very, very quickly to maximize the team's earnings. At this point, what this allows you to do is look at whether the participant will engage in whistleblowing behavior at the end of the task. Will they engage in cheating? Will they enable the cheater by passing to them? Do they try to censor the cheater in any sort of way? So kind of a platform for behavioral ethics researchers. And at the end of the task, they're given the feedback that Synergize is still in beta form. Did your team experience any problems? So we give them this sort of vague opportunity to talk, and it gives them the chance to go in and basically whistleblow on their teammates that have been misbehaving. So both of these versions can be easily modified. Some things that you can change without having to go digging into the actual code. The pre-questions in the survey, the player names and player profiles in the one version. So the personality-based version, you can change, obviously, what you're manipulating about them. You can change the comments that are made by all three of the Confederates. Two of them are generally set to be very neutral, with one being the one that's your target Confederate that you're going to manipulate, but you could change the comments for any of them. There's also the ability to pre-record voice messages. So participants think they're actually able to speak into a microphone to talk to the other players. You can turn this feature on and off so it uses just comments instead of voice, or you can pre-record your own MP3 files and use voice actors, which is what we did in that AMJ I was talking about. You can change the turn passing behaviors to add elements of exclusion or just to put more play pressure on the real participant. You can change whether it's time-based versus turn-based when the game will end. You can also change post-survey targets and questions. So after the game is over, what are people asked about their experience or things like this. And since my slides will be available, here's some resources for you. There's YouTube videos of both versions of the tasks. You can get an idea of what the participant experience would look like. On the Inquisit website, there's a playable demonstration of the personality traits version, and then all the materials that you would need to go use these and modify them within the Inquisit framework are on a Google Drive that Feng set up. So all those